And now, let's welcome Pastor Ross.
Good morning. I don't know if you know this or not, but it is a proven fact that when you go to the early service on the time change weekend, God puts an extra jewel in your crown when you get to heaven. So, well done on your part, guys. Give it up for yourselves. Well, I do want to welcome you to Next Level Church. Excited for you to be here today. We are kicking off a brand new series, but before we dive into that, I want to give a few shout-outs. First off, every Sunday is someone's first time at Next Level Church. Would you help me welcome our first-time guests that are here today? I also want to give a special shout-out to those that are serving in our military and to our online audience who's watching today. Would you help me welcome them? Appreciate y'all participating in the shout-outs. So today we are kicking off a brand new series, and I want to tell you where this series came from, the heart behind it. I want to pull back the curtains and let you know what inspired this series. Every single morning, I have a rule that before I get out of bed and before I check my phone, I spend time praying and reading the Bible. And I do that primarily by using an app called YouVersion. And our church actually has a connection with YouVersion. If Next Level is your church, you can jump on YouVersion. It's a free app in the App Store, and you can make Next Level your church, and then you can see the plans that we do. We try to have a plan that goes along with every series to give you something to learn about. But I do a couple plans through YouVersion every single day. One of them I do with my wife, another one I do with a couple friends, and the one that I'm doing with a couple friends, we are going through the entire Bible, and we're spending most of the time right now in the Old Testament, and most days it's about a chapter or two in the Old Testament. And so if you're not familiar with the Old Testament, it is primarily the story of God's people that at some point they end up in slavery in Egypt, and then God leads a guy by the name of Moses to come and to deliver the people. Now, the Old Testament, it was written in Hebrew, and so the Hebrew name for Moses, that we translate Moses, is Charlton Heston. We've translated that. You have to be like 40 years old or up to get that joke. But God leads a guy by the name of Moses into the promised land. God does all these amazing miracles, and eventually the Israelites are freed from slavery. They escape from slavery. They walk out, and then there's this water that's separating them. They can't get to the other side. The Egyptian army is chasing after them. God does a miracle and parts the Red Sea. They walk on dry land. The Egyptian army follows after them, and the water covers over the Egyptian army, kills them all, and then all of a sudden now you have close to 1 million people who are in the wilderness. They used to be slaves. They have no police force. They have no government. They have no kitchens. They have no homes. They have nothing. They are in the wilderness. And these people complain all the time. Like, as I'm reading through the Old Testament and just going book by book, I constantly am seeing how God is providing and God's doing these amazing miracles, and his people are just negative and they're complaining. And everything's not working out their way, and they're constantly saying, woe is me. And as I was reading about how they are in the wilderness and they're about to enter into the promised land, they go to look into this promised land. It's going to be the new home that God has promised them. And as they walk into the promised land, they're like, oh, this is scary. There's giants here. Yep, there's great food. This would be a great place to raise our kids, but we're scared. And they complain literally about the promised land. And as I was reading that, I was reminded of a quote that I saw heard from a pastor. His name is Mark Batterson. He's a pastor in D.C. And Pastor Mark Batterson says, negativity is more than an attitude issue. It's a spiritual issue. It could cost you 40 years and keep you out of the promised land. And what he is referencing is that because the Israelites' attitude, because they complain, God told them that they're not going to go to the promised land. And they literally died out in the wilderness. But I thought about that quote, and then I looked it up, and I was reading it again, and he has some insight that I have not spent a lot of time thinking about. And the insight that he has is that negativity is a spiritual issue. I've always thought that negativity is just a personality issue. Some people see the world as like the cup is half empty. Some see it as it's half full. Some people have a harder life than others. Some people are just a little bit more negative. Some people are born positive. But then I started really digging in and saying, well, is this a spiritual issue? And we have lots of examples through the Old Testament and even in the New Testament of God's people who are complaining, who are grumbling, and there's a negative consequence to their actions. And so that led me to say, you know what, I don't want to follow in their footsteps. I want to do a series that I'm hoping will inspire and will encourage us to be different, to have a different perspective, to understand that negativity does have a cost, and it's a spiritual cost. And I want to show you this through our text for today. We are going to look at the children of Israel. We're going to look at primarily through a text in the book of Exodus, which is the story of God's people exodusing from Egypt into the wilderness. And at Next Level, we honor the text. The way that we do that is by standing to our feet. So I want to invite you to stand your feet and read with me nice and loud. When we get to the reference, Exodus 16:2, you'll see two dots between the 16 and the 2. We like to have some fun, and we just pump our fists and say dot. Dot, want to invite you to do the dot, dot with us. Will you read it with me nice and loud? It says, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. Exodus 16, dot, dot, 2. Now that we've read the text, let's go to God in prayer. Would you bow your heads, close your eyes? And I want to invite you to talk to God. A simple prayer that I pray on a regular basis is, God, speak to my heart and give me the courage to do whatever you tell me to do. Would you spend a few seconds just quietly talking to God in your heart? And God, we need you to speak to us. We are so prone to wander from you. And so we need to hear from you today. And what's amazing is that you still speak today, God. You're not distant, but you're here. You're close to us. And the way that you primarily speak is through your word. So we ask that you would speak to our hearts through your text today, through the Bible. And we ask that you would give us the courage to do whatever you tell us to do. And God, I ask that the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight. Oh Lord, you are my rock and my redeemer. In Jesus' name, amen. You may have a seat. So your attitude is incredibly powerful. Your attitude, the way that you see certain circumstances and the way that you respond to those circumstances is actually more powerful than the circumstances that you are in. Now, oftentimes, I have just viewed things as some people have an easier life, some people have a harder life, but what research actually shows us is that it's not the challenges that you face, it's your attitude as you face those challenges. Researcher Albert Ellis, he came up with a rational emotive behavior therapy, which says how people react to events is determined largely by their view of the events, not the events themselves. So what he is saying is that your attitude, the way that you view the event, is more powerful than actually the event that has happened. This is why, have you ever been to like a movie and some people loved the movie and some people hated it? Same movie, very different response. Have you ever been to a concert or even to a church service where you lean over and you're like, that was horrible, and the other person's like, no, that was great. Same thing happened, two very different perspectives. Why? It's because it's our attitude that shapes the circumstances that we're in. The way that we see things ultimately it becomes the way that we experience these things. There's a story about a shoe factory from America, and it's years ago before technology took over, and the shoe factory was wanting to expand, and so they sent 2 scouts to Africa, different parts of Africa, to find out if there's opportunity for them to expand and to sell their shoes there. They sent the 2 scouts, and after some time, the scouts sent a telegram back. So this is before email, it's before text messaging. They sent a telegram back. And the scouts' perspective of where they were at was very different. The first scout, he sent back this message: situation hopeless. No one wears shoes. A little while later, the other scout had a very different perspective. He said, glorious business opportunity. No one wears shoes. Same circumstance, different perspective. It is your perspective and your attitude that shapes how you actually view these experiences. Your attitude is incredibly important. Do you see a negative situation as an opportunity for God to do a miracle? Or do you see a negative situation as, woe is me, I have no hope? Bad things will happen, tough things will happen to all of us, but it's your attitude when you're going through that difficulty that makes a massive difference. And we're going to see this in our text today. The Israelites, they've escaped Egypt. They've experienced God's miracles left and right. But now they are in the desert and they are wandering. And right away, they start complaining. Exodus 16, verse 2, it says, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. So Moses was the leader. His brother Aaron was the spokesperson. And it says the whole community. You're telling me not one person was optimistic? Not one person said, hey, I know leadership is hard. I know this is difficult. The whole community. Why did the whole community complain? Because negativity breeds negativity. When you are around negativity, you take it on. It is like a cancer to your soul. The whole community complains against Moses and Aaron. Remember, our grumbling, and when I say grumbling, it's synonymous with complaining. Your complaining or grumbling has more to do with your attitude than the actual situation. We live in a culture today where people grumble and complain. It seems like about literally everything. A few years ago, me and my wife, we took our kids to Disney World, and they were young enough to where the magic was really there. And Disney's like the happiest place on earth. That's like their tagline. And we went in October. We pulled them from school, and we went to Disney. And I thought that in October it would be a little bit cooler out, but it was not. It was brutal hot. It was like the fires of Mordor hot. It was horrible hot outside. And all the lines were super long. Like, I don't know if there's ever a season where you don't have to wait in line when you go to Disney. You just wait in line after line. And most of the rides, we had to wait about 2 hours before we would get on the ride. And so, our kids are elementary school, young age at the time, and we're waiting hours, and it's hot, and everything is really expensive. But you know what? We're having the time of our life. We're loving it. We're creating core memories with our kids. We're doing all the things. We're taking the pictures. We're seeing the characters. We are loving this. We don't know if we're ever going to get back to Disney again. Well, we walk into one line, and it's a little bit extra long. The wait time is really, really long. And so as we're standing out in the sun and in the heat, my wife says, hey, would you mind going and getting us some Dole Whips? And I was like, I don't even know what that is. And they're like, it's a magical thing at Disney. It's like this pineapple ice cream called the Dole Whip, and you can only get it here in Disney. And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll go do that. So I get out of line, and I go find a kiosk that is selling it. And I stand in another line. It's about a 10-minute line to get this ice cream. And behind me, there is two people that stand right behind me, and they're also waiting in this line. And it is a daughter who's probably about my age and her father. And as we're standing in this line for 10 minutes, they are just complaining about everything that's wrong with Disney. Why are the lines so long? It's so hot. It's miserable hot out here. Everything is so expensive. This Dole Whip's not even that good. I mean, literally they are complaining about everything. And I'm sitting there thinking, how sad is it that you guys have invested thousands of dollars and you're missing out on an opportunity to create memories with your family? Is everything they said true? Yes. But their attitude is caused them to miss out on the fun, on the greatness of that experience. But that leads us to ask a question, because what do we do when circumstances are difficult? Is every complaint a negative thing? Everything that those people said about Disney was true. It was hot out, the lines were long, it was expensive. So when we go through situations and they're difficult, or do we have to fake it? Do we have to pretend to be positive? Are we not allowed to say anything remotely negative? The answer is no. You can go through difficult things, and God can handle your complaints. But I want to show you that it's a matter of your attitude and your posture towards God. The scriptures make a distinction between grumbling and groaning. I one time said groaning to a group of students, and they started laughing. It's kind of a funny word to say, groaning. But the scriptures make a difference between grumbling and groaning. What the Israelites were doing in this instance was grumbling. I want to show you a time where they groaned before God and the difference between it. The Israelites were in slavery for 430 years. 430 years they were slaves. And the longer they were in slavery, the more Pharaoh would ramp up their punishments. They kept expanding. Their families kept growing. They kept getting more powerful, and so he would punish them even more. He would take away their food. He would put their workload. He would maximize it. He would punish them because they were growing. So after 430 years, they cry out to God, and they're like, God, hear our prayer. They groan before God. And look at what the text says, Exodus 2:24. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God heard their groaning, and God wasn't upset. He wasn't mad that they groaned. Being in slavery and having Pharaoh punish them is a horrible thing. It's something that you should groan about. It's not like you should put a positive attitude on and say, I got beat today again for putting up the pyramids. Woohoo! Like, you shouldn't fake it till you make it. There are real difficulties in life, but the difference between a groan and a grumble is a groan has hope that God can provide a miracle. And the groan is to God. It's crying out to God, saying, God, I know you see my circumstance. This is tough, but I believe that you are still God, and I believe you can deliver. Groaning comes out of difficult circumstances, but grumbling comes out of not getting our way. And there's a difference. Groaning is, this is a tough situation, God. This is something that I'm not prepared for. I don't know how to raise my kids through this stage that they're in. God, I don't know how to do this transition at my work. God, I don't know how to deal with the political climate in America. God, we're struggling with our finances. This is a hard thing. I'm bringing this to you. But when we grumble, it's, well, that line was long. Preacher wasn't very funny today. My boss is an idiot. None of my teachers like me. Grumbling is about not getting our way. Someone didn't do something to cater to you, and it causes you to complain. There is a major difference, and I want to make sure that you hear this because God can handle our groans to him. And you can follow God, and that does not mean your life will be perfect. It does not mean that every circumstance will ever work out your way. We go through hard circumstances, and the amazing thing about being a Christian is that God walks alongside of us in those hard circumstances. So when you go through a difficulty, you don't have to fake it till you make it. You don't have to put a fake smile on your face. You don't have to pretend like everything is rosy. But if you're a Christian, you do need to bring that to God. Because God is your source of hope. And God's the one that's going to give you the strength to make it through that circumstance. The Israelites, once they get out of slavery and they get into the wilderness, they're not groaning before God. They're grumbling about God. Grumbling is a negative attitude that does not honor God. Groaning is a cry out to God. God, I need you. God, I don't know what I'm doing. God, this is tough. Like my heart hurts for this. Grumbling is, why didn't God do it for me this way? Why didn't God answer my prayer? Why didn't God give me what I wanted? There's a difference between grumbling and groaning. So now that we understand that difference, let's look at what the Israelites were grumbling about. Exodus 16, verse 3. It says, the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Did you catch what they groaned about? What they grumbled about? Grumbling, the issue with grumbling is because it's self-centered, because it's about not getting your way, it causes you to exaggerate your negative circumstances. The grumbling, it's an exaggeration of a problem. There's a real problem here that they should have groaned about. There's over 1 million people in the wilderness and they don't have food. That's a serious problem. That's something you should go to God before. You shouldn't just put a positive attitude on that and say, oh, we'll make it. We're going to fake it till we make it. We're going to put a smile on our face as our kids are starving. It's a real problem. But they didn't go to God. They complained about God's leadership. And when they complained, it was an exaggeration. We had it so much better when we were slaves. You ever listen to someone complain? It's almost always an exaggeration. My boss is an idiot. He does nothing right. Nothing? Not one thing? My kids are so selfish. They never pick up after themselves. Never, not one time in the history of their lives. My church, man, it's never meeting my needs. There's just so many cliques. There's not one person that's not a part of a clique at every church in America. Grumbling causes us to exaggerate the negative. It exaggerates the problem, and it focuses on us not getting our way. The problem with the Israelites' complaint is that they had forgotten who they were talking about. The same God that delivered them from slavery is the one they were now complaining about. The situation was difficult. It was hard. But instead of going to God and saying, God, remember how you delivered us from slavery? Remember how you parted the Red Sea? They now are saying, where's our food? And why haven't you provided in this circumstance? And complaining blinds us. It exaggerates our issues, and it causes us to forget about the amazing things that God has done. So let's keep going in our text, see what happens next. Exodus 16, verses 12 through 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Can we just pause there for a second? Whether you groan out to God or grumble before God, God hears it. He hears it because he's a good God and he can handle it. And we've all made mistakes and we've all let our humanness get ahead of us. So God answers their prayer even though they didn't have a good attitude. But I want to show you this is a bigger problem than just the complaint. Tell them, this is God speaking, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Okay, so they grumble before God. They say we have no food. And God says, I'm going to provide a miracle so that you know I am God. I am the source of your help. I am the source of your hope. I'm the one that hears you and provides. And the miracle that he provided was literally, it was a miracle. Every single morning when they woke up, there was dew on the ground, and the dew would turn into literally frosted flakes. It was amazing. They're great. And they would gather up these frosted flakes. And the text tells us that if they stored them, if they tried to store some from later, they would go bad. And maggots would come in the frosted flakes. Because God wanted them to trust every single day that he would provide for them. So there was no backup plan. There was no storage. It was every day, God, we are trusting that you're going to provide for our needs. And at nighttime, quail would just come in their camp. And they would have meat to eat. God literally provided everything that they needed. This is such an amazing verse. But I can't help but find a little bit of humor in it, because I can just imagine if I was a parent in the wilderness and you're sleeping in tents and you've left your home and you've got a bunch of kids roaming around. I just put myself in their sandals for a little bit, and I imagine like what this was like. Every morning for breakfast, you go outside and you collect the frosted flakes and you bring it into your kids. And I can just imagine, like the kids had to have been similar to my kids back then. The kids would look at it and say, well, Mama, what is that? It is, what is it? What do you mean, it is, what is it? That's what it's called. It's called, what is it? We don't know what else to call it. It's called, what is it? Yeah, but Mama, I saw you go outside the tent and you picked it off the ground. I just want to know the name of it. Like, can you just tell me it is, what is it? Mama, that doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to eat it until you tell me its name. It is what it is, boy. Just eat the food and be quiet. You ever been there with kids where they like complain about the things you provided? I can't imagine how difficult this situation was that God provides a miracle. It's such a miracle, they don't even have a name for it. They literally are looking at it and they're like, we've never seen this before. What is it? That's its name. How they missed out on calling it Frosted Flakes, I'll never know. They literally called it, what is it? But this is incredibly important because the what is it, which we translate manna, is the way that God provided for them. And in just a few seconds, what we're going to see is that God does this amazing miracle, but the amazing miracle that he does ends up becoming the complaint of the people. Because their hearts weren't changed, because their hearts weren't in the right place, they see God do a miracle, and then they end up complaining about the very miracle that God provides. Have you ever been there? Have you ever prayed that God would provide a job, and then once you get a job, 2-3 years go by, and then you start to complain about the very job that God provided? Have you ever prayed when you were single and said, God, would you provide a spouse? I just want to marry someone. And then you get married and you're like, God, why didn't you give me someone else? If you've ever gone through infertility, did you ever pray, God, would you provide? Would you give us kids? And then once you get kids, it's like, they're so difficult. They're so ornery. They don't listen. So often we complain about the very miracles that God has given us. And I'm convinced that whenever there is a Christian complaining, it's because they have a heart problem. And the Israelites had a heart problem. That God provides for them and God gives them what they need, but they keep complaining. They constantly complain. The gospel tells us that we are more sinful than we care to admit, but we are way more loved by God than we could ever imagine. If you were here today and you're like, yeah, I am a complainer, just be honest with yourself. Because our complaints are a sign that we need God's love. And our complaints are a sign that we have some selfishness in here. And if God doesn't capture your heart, and if God doesn't capture my heart, we will complain about the very miracles that God has provided for us, and we will miss the promises in the promised land. God provides manna, and for a little while it was amazing, but after a while it becomes a source of their complaint. I want to fast forward a little over 2 years after this miracle. 2 years go by. And look at what happens with the Israelites. Numbers 11, 4 through 6. It says, the rabble with them began to crave other food. I want to stop there just for a second. Who is the rabble? The text tells us that the rabble was a group of people that came with them out of slavery. That the Israelites escaped slavery, but God did so many miracles that there were Egyptians who were like, your God must be the true God. And they said, can we go with you on this journey? Can we join you? They didn't all convert to worship this God. They just wanted to be a part of it. But they left their homes to go on this wilderness journey with the Israelites. And after 2 years of eating the manna from heaven, the rabble started to complain. And they started to say, if only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, melons, leeks. I don't even know what a leek is. It sounds gag nasty. I'd rather eat what is it than a leek. Onions and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna. The rabble ends up complaining, and the rabble ends up complaining to the Israelites, who end up taking on their negativity. Understand this, that negativity breeds negativity. And you've got to be very careful when someone comes to you and brings a complaint to you. You've got to be very careful with what you do with their complaint. Because so often what I see in America today is I see people being outraged about someone else's outrage. Did this situation happen to you? No, but I watched a news program where they ranted about it for an hour, and now I'm upset. You're taking on someone else's outrage. Be very careful about the negativity that you listen to. It changes your perspective about the world. And the riffraff starts to complain. They start to grumble. They start to say, hey, I wish we had better food. I wish we were back in Egypt. Please, if you're taking notes, I encourage you to write this down. Don't let someone grumble to you about the place God has you in. It will impact how you see the miracle God has given you. So what do you do if you have a negative person in your life and they're just constantly complaining? You need to stop them in a kind way, say, that's not my perspective. When they come to you and they say, isn't the boss an idiot? Hey, hold on a second. That's not my perspective. Thank you for sharing that, but that's not my perspective. I have a different perspective about that. You've got to be careful and diligent and push back about other people's negativity, because if you're not careful, their negativity will change the way that you see a circumstance. And the very circumstance that you prayed for will end up becoming a complaint to the God that you serve. You've got to be incredibly diligent and careful, because negativity breeds negativity. Listen, if you have a miracle in your life that God has provided, if there's ever been anything in your life that you've asked for, God, would you bring me to a church? And he brings you and he gives you a church. Or God, I pray for a spouse and he gives you a spouse. Or God, I pray for kids or a job. If you've ever had God answer a prayer, you've got to be very careful that you don't start complaining about the very miracle that God provided. And the children of Israel, yeah, they got tired of the manna, but in my opinion, they should have pulled a Bubba Gump. You remember Bubba from the movie Forrest Gump when he's talking about shrimp? The children of Israel they should have just made some manna. They should have made shrimp manna, barbecue manna. You can broil it, bake it, saute it, pan fry it, deep fry it, stir fry it. There's pineapple manna, lemon manna, coconut manna, pepper manna, manna soup, manna stew, manna salad, manna and potatoes, manna burger, manna sandwich. That's about it. You can do a million things with manna. You better get creative with the manna that God's given you. Because if you don't, you'll start complaining about the very miracle that God has given you. Let's keep going in the text. Numbers 11:10. Moses heard the people of every family wailing at the entrance of their tents. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. When the people groaned before God and said, God, we're in slavery, God doesn't get angry. But when the people grumble against God, he becomes angry. Because it's a heart issue. It's not a circumstance issue. And the people started complaining about the very miracle that God provided. So what do? What is a practical step that you can do? When circumstances don't go your way, when you have a bad attitude, you have two choices. Number one, you can change the circumstance, or number two, you can change your attitude. Life's not always going to go your way. And there are difficulties that we need to bring to God, and we need to have conversations, and there's things that we need to improve. But if you are in a tough situation, before you complain, before you grumble, before you get negative about it, ask yourself, can I change this circumstance? Can I? If you're complaining about your job every day, have you considered changing jobs? Maybe you just need to change jobs. If you're complaining about a circumstance, whether it's politics in our country, have you gotten more involved or figured out a way to help with the problem? Don't just complain about something. Ask, is there something I can do to change this circumstance? But if you ask yourself, is there anything I can do to change this circumstance, and the answer is no, then your only hope is to change your attitude about the circumstance. And you may not be able to change a job, and you may not be able to change a spouse, and you may not be able to exchange your kids with someone else's. You may not be able to change your circumstance, but you can change your attitude. And how do you change your attitude about a negative situation? You start praising God for the things He has given you for. Praise is our battle against the negativity that we face. If you go to God and you say, God, thank you for this manna. We are getting a little tired of it. Can you provide something else? I think that's a prayer God will answer. But when you just go to God and you say, why did you do this for me? When you grumble before God, this text tells us that He gets upset. He gets frustrated with it. So what can you do about this? Well, you can start practicing gratitude. And when you can't change your circumstance, you can change your attitude. So find a way to thank God for it. Find a positive aspect to literally say, God, this is a tough situation, but I'm going to thank you for the good that I do have. If you don't thank God for the good that you do have, the bad will consume you. Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote about his experiences in Nazi concentration camps. And he tells us some insight that is pretty horrific. He said in the Nazi concentration camp, when you were a prisoner, they would take everything from you. They would strip you of your clothing. They would strip you of pictures. They would strip you of memories. They literally would take everything away from you so that you would feel like less than a human. And the last thing that they would take away from you is your name. And they would take your name away so that you would feel like you were less than. And Viktor Frankl was given a number instead of a name, and his number was 119,104. So anytime someone addressed him, they had to say that number. They couldn't say his name. Now, this is a very difficult circumstance. This is a circumstance that deserves a groan before God. But Viktor Frankl couldn't change his circumstance. He couldn't get out of the Nazi concentration camp. He couldn't fix it. So what he did was fix his attitude. And he tells us in his diary, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Now, this isn't said by someone giving a TED Talk or trying to motivate us. This is said by someone who was rotting away in a Nazi concentration camp. They've taken everything from me, but they can't take my attitude. Because Viktor Frankl believed in a God that provides, and as long as you believe in a God that provides, you have a little bit of hope for even the worst circumstances. And that's the attitude that we bring towards our complaints. Yes, it's hard. Yes, this is difficult. Yes, I don't know what I'm doing. But God, I have hope that this is an opportunity for you to provide another miracle. Are you missing the very miracles that God has given you because of your grumbling? Are you missing out on Disney World because you're complaining about how hot it is? Are you missing out on what God is doing in your church because you're complaining that it's not like your old church? Are you missing out on the joys God wants to give you with family because you're comparing your family to what you see on Instagram and you're like, why isn't my family more like them? Stop comparing and complaining about things and start thanking God for what you have and watch how it changes your perspective. At the end of the day, God can handle our complaints, He can handle our grumbles, but it's a heart issue. And this is why this text is so important to us. Exodus 16:2, it says, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be a people that's known as a grumbler. I don't want to grumble about the things that God has provided. And we all go through difficult circumstances, but may we be a people that brings our complaints to God. And may we find hope that He still does miracles today. And the very God that provided for the Israelites can provide for your needs. And if you can't change your circumstance, may we be a people that allows God to change our attitude. Will you pray with me? God, we come before you and we just thank you that you are a God that provides. That you're a God that provides manna in deserts, that you provide the things that we need. God, that doesn't mean that life is easy. Some of us in the room today, we are going through very difficult circumstances. Some of us in the room today, we are going through things that we have legitimate complaints. And I thank you, God, that you hear our prayers, that you hear our cries, that you're not mad at us for coming before you and telling you what we need. And you're not mad at us for saying this is difficult and this is hard. We thank you that you are a God that walks with us in the wilderness and that walks with us through our difficulties. And God, right now we ask that you would just change our hearts and our minds so that we could be people that learn how to not complain in the promised land. We thank you for what you're going to do. In Jesus' name, amen.